Thank you, Rabbi Maroof, for joining us. So the opening question was inspired by Kodesh Press's book, Strauss, Spinoza, and Sinai. In a well-known essay that prefaced his study of Spinoza, Leo Strauss critically examines modern philosophy's challenge to traditional religion. There he argues that while the Enlightenment had failed to decisively refute orthodoxy, at the same time, orthodoxy could only claim to believe its core tenets were true, but could not claim to know they were true. Strauss leaves the question at an impasse. Both the Enlightenment and orthodoxy rest on axioms that neither side can fully prove or fully refute. Much of modern thought tries to square the circle of how to live in a world without belief. The better question is whether it is possible to recover authentic religious belief in the modern world.
Okay. So first of all, greetings to all of your viewers from the Holy Land. We're both in darkness now, but I'm in the morning and you're at night. But Bezrat Hashem, we'll be able to have this communication successfully over such a long distance. It's amazing that we're able to do that. The issue of belief is not new to classical Jewish thought, really. And it's not new to classical thought, because even going all the way back to Aristotelian writing, Aristotle spoke about the idea of different measures of truth or different measures of validity of ideas, depending upon what kind of ideas they are. So, for example, if you're dealing with mathematics, the standard of mathematical proof is different than the standard of other sorts of proof. For instance, in mathematics, we expect absolute proof. We don't expect it to be a good argument. When it comes to scientific proof, we can disprove ideas in science, but it's a lot harder to prove positively ideas in science. They're always subject to refutation from further examination, further experimentation, further data that emerges that calls earlier conclusions into question, and so on. So scientific proof is of a different nature than mathematical proof. And then when it comes to something like historical proof or moral arguments, so things become even less definitive in the sense that the kind of a standard you're going to employ for proof in those areas is going to be fundamentally different than the kind of standard to employ when you're evaluating, let's say, a mathematical argument or even a scientific argument. And this is something where I'd say modern thought has veered into a zone where it takes mathematical proof to be the gold standard in pretty much every area of inquiry. And ironically, when I think about it now, just as I'm saying it now, Spinoza was kind of the person who originated that, because if you read Spinoza's writing, especially the Ethics is the classic example of that. He tries to prove everything in his system of thought. I don't know if you guys have had the chance to read Spinoza yet. I wouldn't say that it's a waste of time. I think that there's some interesting ideas that he does have. He organizes his the whole edifice of his thought in mathematical terms. Actually, he follows like a Euclidean method where he tries to lay out, axioms and then what you can derive from the axioms and so on, postulates, axioms, the whole thing. It reads like Euclid's actual work, like the elements. It seriously tries to demonstrate everything in a mathematical way. So this kind of thought, this kind of approach to all areas of knowledge, that really the only standard that we can accept is a mathematical standard, has become entrenched in a lot of Western thought, even though we know, when we realize that so much of what we think and so much of what we do is not based on any standard of proof, even remotely approximating that. And so we're kind of living a double life, because we claim that we're seeking a kind of absolute proof, irrefutable proof, after the style of mathematicians, whereas there are so many areas of life in which such a standard of proof is irrelevant or it would be totally inappropriate to the subject matter. This is something that goes all the way back to classical thought. In fact, even the Ramban, if you want to go to a Jewish thinker who isn't associated normally with Aristotelian thought, the Ramban mentions in Milchamot Hashem, in his commentary on the Gemara, like in his commentary in the Talmud, he mentions that standards of proof for different subjects are different, and that you can't expect that the standard of proof in Talmud is going to be the same as the standard of proof in mathematics or astronomy. He mentions it there when he's explaining how there's machloket in the areas of halakha because of the nature of the subject matter, that it doesn't lend itself to the sort of proof that we would seek in other areas of knowledge. This is something that was understood by people in the classical era. It's kind of been forgotten today. But there's an interesting thinker named Mary Midgley. I don't know if I've ever mentioned her before in any of our other discussions, but she speaks about, she has a book in which she speaks about basically how you can look at reality from different vantage points, and they can all be relevant, they can all be true, even though their nature is different. So, for example, she talks about how a person, you can't, even though you can't measure it and you can't define it and you can't prove it, nobody's going to say love is not real. It's obviously real. Nobody's going to say that freedom is not real because I can't measure it and I can't prove its existence mathematically. And she gives a nice example of how you can have a map of the same terrain. You can look at the same terrain, and you can have like a map that shows, one of those maps that shows like topography, and another one that shows the division of the territory into states, and another one that shows the division of the territory into different kinds of climates or into different kinds of terrain. Right? You can have multiple maps of the same exact swath of land. And nobody's going to say that only one of those maps is correct, right? They're not contradictory, and it would be wrong to say only one of those maps of reality is correct. They're all actually correct. They're just reflecting different dimensions of reality. So when we talk about trying to establish proof or to demonstrate something, we have to consider what we're trying to demonstrate and what's a reasonable standard of proof. Now, most people, when it comes to making their choices about belief or about values, have no standard whatsoever, meaning they are just going by the default of whatever their instinct is, or whatever their hunches are, or whatever their feelings are, or whatever is the commonly accepted or the popular view of certain matters. They're not really, they're not going to subject their default view of the world to any standard of proof at all. So even the fact that we're trying to establish ideas based on reason or based on evidence is a chidush. It's a novel idea. And so when you come to questions of belief, the question is, what kind of a support could one have for religious claims? Okay, what kind of support could you have for religious claims? So there's two levels of analyzing the subject. The first one is the religious claim in and of itself reasonable and defensible? Okay. And I'm putting the ideas about God's existence aside, because to my mind, the ideas about God's existence are philosophical ideas that are universal, that transcend any particular religious system, okay? So let's leave that aside. But let's say questions of a particular religion, claims to truth in a particular religion, that as opposed to belief in God, which I'm going to set aside as a different inquiry, okay? When it comes to, let's say, claims of truth of a particular religion, so you have to look, once you've decided that intrinsically the ideas are, let's say, for instance, Yetziat Mitzrayim as an example of something in Judaism, okay? Is it intrinsically impossible for there to have been a Yetziat Mitzrayim? No, if there's a God that created the universe, and has the ability to manipulate and to direct creation in accordance with his will, so then there's nothing intrinsically problematic about there being a Yetziat Mitzrayim. You can talk about historical evidence for Yetziat Mitzrayim, whether it's true or not historically. So you have to evaluate. And what Judaism offers that no other religion offers is that its fundamental claims in terms of religious claims, those claims that are at the heart of Judaism, that are at the core of Judaism, are based upon historical events. So they're not based upon individual testimony or faith of an individual, as opposed to every other religion in the history of mankind, which is based upon one prophet or one messenger or one individual, one leader who claims to have experienced certain revelations and is able to convince or persuade his or her adherents to follow a particular path or to adopt certain beliefs. Okay, that's what makes Judaism different, that when you're speaking about Judaism, you're speaking about a nation that has as its historical inheritance, its heritage, events that are brought as evidence for the core claims of the faith system. And really, that's all you could have reasonably in the context of religious claims about a particular revelation or particular divine interventions. That's all you could have. Because by nature, by definition, in other words, as opposed to an idea that God exists, an abstract idea that God exists, or that God's laws govern the universe, which is something which would be at all times and all places absolutely true, when you're dealing with divine intervention at a particular place, particular time, particular circumstances, the sea splitting, makat bechorot, whatever it is. When you're dealing with that kind of a phenomenon, what's the only way that I can demonstrate that that's true? It's a historical event. Either it happened or it didn't happen. It's not something that I can prove mathematically. I can't prove mathematically that George Washington existed. Right? I could bring a lot of documents. I could say, well, how are you going to explain American history if you don't believe in George Washington? How are you going to explain American history if you don't believe in the Revolutionary War took place? How are you going to explain all these landmarks that are dedicated to him? How are you going to explain all these, the letter that he wrote and this activity that he did? Who did it if it wasn't him? Okay, we can come up with a lot of different historical points of evidence, but a real hardline skeptic will say at the end of the day, do you really know there was George Washington? Do you know? You don't really know. You got it from a textbook. You got it from documents that existed, but it could be that it's one big fabricated conspiracy that they wanted to invent this iconic person who never tells a lie. He chopped down the cherry tree and he had to tell the truth to his father to show the integrity of the American people and how we're so principled and this is our icon, whatever. I obviously believe that George Washington existed, but I would not be surprised if somebody could construct a pretty convincing, alternative history in which it wasn't true, or Abraham Lincoln, or any of these other people that are that you would be hard pressed to convince anybody normal or rational that they didn't exist. You probably would, just like it's the same thing as did Jesus exist? It's like a lot of people are like, well, maybe he didn't exist. I've heard people even in the Jewish community say stuff like that. The possibility that he didn't exist, you just have to invent somebody else to explain how the whole movement started. So what's the point of saying he didn't exist? So the reality is that when it comes to historical issues, all that we have is what is the best historical evidence. And what the Torah did basically was the best possible way, meaning if there is a best way to provide evidence, to provide a rational basis for religious claims, it is embedding those religious claims in the national historical narrative of a people, because that's the hardest to fabricate. That is the hardest to alter or to invent out of whole cloth, the historical narrative of a people. Okay, you're going to say Yetziat Mitzrayim didn't happen, so then why is it in every single one of our texts? Why did every prophet recall it to the Jewish people? Why is it embedded in every single ritual and the historical consciousness of the entire nation and every document and in every religious practice and in every aspect of the culture? It's referred to. Why? But so that's the only way a historical event can achieve demonstrated status, let's say status of that it's no longer a subject of dispute. Obviously, I'm talking about George Washington. It's only a couple of hundred years ago relative to something that's thousands of years ago. But still, have you noticed that if they find a piece of pottery from Moab or they find a piece of broken pottery, or some inscription from Babylonia from thousands of years ago, all of a sudden every archaeologist tries to draw all of the implications of that piece of pottery for the entire history of the ancient Near East, and so on and so forth. But the fact that we have documents thousands of years old that were preserved from generation to generation, and a narrative and Pesach and all of this history and all of these details, and that's subject to, we don't accept any of that as evidence. None of that is valid evidence. That's the way that the skeptics are operating. And the reason why they're operating, in my opinion, that way is because it's too dangerous to go the other way. It's too dangerous to acknowledge that there might actually be strong evidence for a particular religious tradition, which obviously, clearly, only Judaism provides that kind of historical evidence. And since the validity of religious claims is about the validity of historical events, that's the main point that I'm trying to say. It's not the validity of ideas. The ideas have to be valid to begin with, or we're not even going to get into the discussion, right? Once the ideas are valid, to be able to authenticate the truth of particular religious claims means to authenticate the truth of revelatory claims, that there was a revelation, or that there were miracles, or that there was divine intervention, or that there were anomalies in Jewish history that distinguish it from the history of other peoples, and so on and so forth. This is where the evidence comes into play. So is there more evidence of the truth of a random belief of a skeptic than there is to the claims of Judaism? Obviously not. Right. I mean, but that's the standard of proof that we have to use. We have to use the standard of proof given that it's a matter of historical record, what would our standard be in evaluating the truth of a historical claim? Because that's really what it's about. Yeah, and I think on that, Judaism, and this is what the Kuzari, of course, talks about, and the Rambam talks about it in a couple of places, both in the Mishneh Torah as well as in Igeret Teman, where he talks about the historical nature of the foundation of Jewish belief.